Speaker. Lawrence, or Larry Reed, class of 1975, became president of the Foundation for Economic Education, or FEE, in 2008. He previously served for 21 years as president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Midland, Michigan. In May 2019, he retired to the role of President Emeritus at FEE and assumed the titles of Humphreys Family Senior Fellow and Ron Manners Global Ambassador for Liberty. Larry holds a bachelor's in economics from Grove City College and a master's in history from Slippery Rock University. He has authored nearly 2,000 columns and articles in newspapers, magazines, and journals in the United States and abroad. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Examiner, Christian Science Monitor, USA Today, the American Spectator, and many, many more. He has authored or co-authored 8 books, the most recent being Was Jesus a Socialist? The Real Heroes, Inspiring True Stories. Sorry, those are 2. It was Jesus Socialist and Real Heroes, Inspiring True Stories of Courage, Character, and Conviction. Larry's interests in political and economic affairs have taken him as a freelance journalist in 92 countries on 6 different continents. He's an advisor to numerous organizations around the world, and in 2022, Reed was named by the President of Poland as a recipient of the highest honor that Poland bestows upon a foreigner, the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. He is a native of Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, and a 30-year resident of Midland, Michigan. Since 2010, Larry has resided in Newnan, Georgia. So I'm excited to introduce Larry to you, not only because of just who he is, but also the friend that he has become, and also to share with you something that is exciting. I've heard throughout the day today some questions about how do we take these principles and these understandings to the next generation. You know, if we're honest, what is lacking in this room today might be the youth, the youngers, who need to carry this as we've talked about, that liberty and freedom can be lost. It's only one generation from being lost. And so this summer, Grove City College is actually launching our own publishing press called Faith and Freedom Press. We're going to begin publishing books by professors, by alumni, by others, as a means to get many of these understandings and virtues and principles out there to the world, creating various marketing and PR as a way to take, as you heard President Lingo talk about, this hidden gem and begin to take it out into the world. And so that's exciting. And ironically, the very first book that we're going to be publishing and printing is right here, called Born of Ideas, How Principles, Faith, and Courage Forged America, written by none other than Larry Reed, who will be sharing some of the understandings coming from this book. So this will be coming out very soon, within the next month to 5-6 weeks at the most. And right before dinner, you're going to hear a really exciting opportunity about maybe how you all can be involved, how you can make this successful, even helping us to unlock a $100,000 grant that we have that's been given that will directly support the Institute for Faith and Freedom. So it's an exciting time. I think there's great times ahead. It's an honor and privilege to be here, and please give a round of applause for my friend Larry Reed.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming today, and Jason's special thanks for that great introduction. What an honor it is to be back on campus. I can hardly believe it's been 51 years since I walked every inch of this campus as a student. 51 years. But time flies when you're having fun, I guess. A special thanks to Paul Kengor and the Institute for Faith and Freedom for extending the invitation. And a very special thanks to the people here at Grove City with whom I worked as we made progress on this forthcoming book. That includes Jason Burt, who I think was the first to seize upon the idea and say, hey, we might be able to do that. And also Robert Ryder. I saw him here a little bit before. Yeah, Robert's been involved behind the scenes. And Gary Smith, where did he go? He spoke to us earlier today. Oh, darn. Well, I wanted to say thanks to Gary, because I think I took every single editorial suggestion or fix that he suggested. I mean, I thought they were magnificent. He was a tremendous help along the way in the production of this forthcoming book. So when the book comes out, if you buy it and you like it, please let me know. If you buy it and don't like it, then you need to talk to Gary Smith. Well, what a special time to be here, too, with the college celebrating its 150th and the country its 250th. We know from the earlier speakers today what an exceptional moment that was in 1776 when this country was founded. I think it was you, Michael, in your talk at noon. You referenced someone who said the American founding was the most significant event in how many years? 400 years? Easily. Incredibly consequential. I mean, think about it. If the American patriots had lost the Revolutionary War, we'd all be talking English today. maybe better English. But for serious reasons, it was an incredibly consequential event. You know, we hear so often various kinds of paeans or praise for the so-called common man. And I think, again, Michael, you mentioned Aaron Copland's fanfare for the common man. We write songs about the common man. And there is a sense in which you can say to be among the common man is laudable, I guess, but I take a look at the larger picture, and I prefer that people think that what most blesses us as a people are the uncommon amongst us. It's not the common that we should strive to emulate, rather it's the uncommon. It's the uncommon to whom we owe the greatest debt of gratitude, and we had so many uncommon people who were involved in the creation of this great country. I don't know how anybody can see it as anything but providential. As a parent, have you ever raised a child with the advice of, hey, work hard, you might become common someday? I mean, that sounds like child abuse to me. We tell our kids, don't blend in with the crowd, don't strive to simply be average, be uncommonly good, uncommonly generous, uncommonly courageous, uncommonly responsible. Fill in the blank adjective. We want our children to be uncommonly good at whatever they choose to do. And thankfully, a lot of them have taken your advice. The story of America's founding is full of uncommon people who rose to the occasion to make America what it is today. Our founders had their heroes. They were heroes themselves, and I want to talk about a few of them that I bring up in the book. But I also want to say that they had their heroes, and among them were some great and notable Romans of the ancient republic. One of them was a man named Cato. Cato gave his life, took his own life, rather than see life under a dictator that Julius Caesar was positioning himself to become. And for that reason alone, many of our founders who knew what Cato had done looked up to him. In fact, at Valley Forge, George Washington ordered that a play be presented before the men. And from that winter of 1777-78 was a vicious one. You wouldn't think they'd have time to watch a play. Members of Congress had cautioned Washington ahead of time, don't let the troops see that play. It will only dispirit them, because it ends with Cato taking his life. But Washington knew that if the men could see this play and come to know the story of Cato, what he believed in, the principles of liberty as enshrined in the old Roman Republic, they would admire him, that they would be emboldened by his life. And he was right. They performed the play, and our troops were greatly inspired by it. Another Roman that our founders looked to was Marcus Tullius Cicero, the last great defender of the Roman Republic. Historians to this day will argue amongst themselves, well, when did the Roman Republic end? We know that it lasted about 500 years, followed by 500 years of an imperial autocracy or dictatorship with emperors, but the Republic period lasted almost until the birth of Christ for about 500 years. When did it end? Some will say, well, it was when Julius Caesar foisted himself upon the Senate and got them to declare him dictator for life. That's a reasonable case, but we also know that that only lasted not for life, but for, yeah, it did last for life, come to think of it, but that was only 1 month. And then Caesar was out of the picture. And the men who engineered the assassination, of course, led by Brutus, really did so because they were hoping for a restoration of the liberties of the Republic. That's not what ultimately happened, but that's why they did it. So you might say it ended with Julius Caesar. Some will say, no, it ended in 27 BC, a few years later, when Octavian announces he's going to be an emperor. He becomes the first and is known to this day by the name of Augustus. After he defeated Mark Antony, he says, I'm in charge now, and I'm the first of what would be quite a few Roman emperors. Well, you can make a case for that. But I think the case that I like to make, anyway, as to when the Republic ended was the day that Cicero was assassinated in 43 BC. Why do I say that? Because Cicero was the last great, brave defender of the liberties of the old Republic. After he was gone, nobody else had the courage to come forward and stand for what they knew to be right. Nobody else. And so it was only a matter of time before what was left of a crumbling republic would become something that didn't look like a republic at all. The empire that lasted another 500 years under a system of tyranny. The founders of America were quite knowledgeable about Roman history. In fact, the common man, if I could use that phrase that I just criticized, in America in the 18th century, they knew a lot about ancient Rome. It was standard procedure to educate young people about such things as the experience of the greatest republic that had ever previously existed. I don't think Americans today know a fraction of what the average American knew about ancient Rome and its republic 250 years ago. Well, when does the story of America begin? Paul, I think it was, raised that question, or maybe it was Gary, it was sometime this afternoon anyway. When did it begin? Some say, well, 1607, because that's when Jamestown was founded, the first permanent English settlement in North America. You can make a case for that. Another case can be made that, no, it really began in 1620 with the landing of the Pilgrims, and shortly before their landing, the creation of what we call the Mayflower Compact. There's the 1619 school that says, no, it began with the first boat that brought the first slaves to America in 1619. I regard that as absolutely preposterously absurd. It's like saying if, the first settlers brought pots and pans with them, so we can say America is forever defined by cookware because of that first boat that brought pots and pans with them. We were not exceptional. We never became exceptional because we had slavery. That was ubiquitous, as Paul pointed out. If America is exceptional on the slavery question, it's because of the lengths to which we went to get rid of it, and not because we had it, as virtually everybody else did, and did for centuries. I think the best case to answer that question I've just posed is 1620. Why? Because of the Mayflower Compact. If you remember the story from your history, you recall that the Pilgrims, who had a problem with the established Church of England, left England. They didn't come straight to America. They went to Holland, and there they stayed for 10 years, waiting until they could get a vessel to take them across the Atlantic to the New World. They finally came, but the investors in the project said, well, we'll invest in this proposed settlement, but we're going to put some other people on the boat with you. So there were Pilgrims plus what the Pilgrims called the strangers that the investors insisted be on the boat. These were people with various skills that the investors said these Pilgrims are going to need once they get over there to help establish the colony. But they weren't on the boat for the reasons that the Pilgrims were. religious freedom in most, if not every case, was not the issue with them. Well, just before the Pilgrims were to land, which was supposed to be, incidentally, in Virginia, but they landed far north because the boat was knocked off course by storms. Well, then when it became apparent that they weren't going to land where they were supposed to, the strangers started grumbling. And they said to these pilgrims, hey, we're not bound by our contract anymore. We're not landing where we're supposed to. So if we want to, get on the next boat back home, that's what we're going to do. So the pilgrims and the strangers had to resolve this dispute. And they ended up coming together with a document we call the Mayflower Compact, which was the first document of governance between people, not between a group of people and a monarch. This was between two groups of people on the same boat where they said, look, once we get to shore, even though it's not where we're supposed to be, we're going to have to settle there, and we will establish a government of mutual consent whereby all of us will have a say in who governs us. That, I think, is more of a definition of what America would become than the first boat that brought the first slaves, or the first settlement like at Jamestown, which didn't produce anything like a document of the caliber of the Mayflower Compact. As has been pointed out by at least one other speaker today, we had before the revolution in 1776, we had a revolution in ideas. And there were two great movements of ideas, you might say, that I think had the greatest impact on the founding generation. One was the ideas of the Enlightenment, which came from Europe to the United States, beginning in the late 17th century and for the next 100 years. It emphasized things like reason, the use of your brain, empirical evidence, the scientific method. It promoted the right to question authority and conventional wisdom. It, in many respects, not every scholar, but most of them also promoted individual liberty to one degree or another. Religious tolerance, the idea of progress, that we can do better from one generation to the next. It was the first time people began to talk about things like natural rights that come by virtue of who and what we are and where we came from. Constitutional government, the separation of church and state, these ideas that we all are well aware of today have their beginnings in this Enlightenment period. And then you also had, percolating at about the same time, a religious development we call the Great Awakening. How many have seen the new movie by that time? Oh, great, isn't it? What'd you think of it? Did anybody not like it? Okay, good. I'd have to ask you to leave. I have seen it twice already. I thought it was so fantastic. And I expect to see it another dozen times in the theaters and at home when it comes out to be streamed. Begins in the late 1730s and proceeds into the 1740s. Franklin P. Cole, a few years ago, actually now it's about 50 years ago, wrote a book called They Preached Liberty. And in this book, he not only has a collection of quotes from mostly New England ministers of the founding period and things they had to say, but also a wonderful introduction. And in that introduction, he says, for a generation before 1776, the congregations of New England had heard and read many declarations of independence. Sermon after sermon referred to, quote, the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. That was core to the Great Awakening. Let me share with you a few actual quotes that Cole produced in this wonderful book of pastors from that period. And just ask yourself, have you heard this from any pulpit in recent times? Here's one. The scriptures cannot be rightfully expounded upon without explaining them in a manner friendly to the cause of freedom. Reverend Charles Turner, 1773. Needless taxes are not for the good, but for the misery of the subjects, tending to reduce them to poverty and distress, and may therefore be justly considered as wanton, undisguised oppression to support the pride, ambition, and extravagance of a few grandees. Reverend Robert Ross, 1775. Unlimited submission and obedience is due to none but God alone. And to suppose that he has given to any particular set of men a power to require obedience to that which is unreasonable, cruel, and unjust is robbing the deity of his justice and goodness. Reverend Samuel West, 1776. All men are naturally in a state of freedom and have an equal claim to liberty. No one by nature nor by any special grant from the great Lord of all has any authority over another. All right, therefore, in any to rule over others must originate from those they rule over and be granted by them. Echoes of the Declaration. That was Reverend John Tucker, 1771. And one more. If the great servants of the people forget their duty, betray their trust, and sell their country, or make war against the most valuable rights and privileges of the people, reason and justice require that they should be discarded and others appointed in their place without regard to their forfeited power. Reverend Samuel Langdon, 1775. Powerful stuff. This is what Americans were hearing more and more as the 1740s, 50s, 60s, and 70s rolled along. But then you have, in the secular world, some important events that unfold beginning in 1760. With Americans marinating in these ideas of the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, you have then in 1760 a new king who assumes the throne in London, and that, of course, is George III. He will rule, he'll be king in name anyway, for 60 years, the last 10 of which he was completely out of it. But still, that's a long time, one of the longest reigning British monarchs. He comes to the throne in 1760, and this is after decades of what historians refer to as the era of salutary neglect. And by that they mean, for decades, the colonies sort of did their own thing. Distant London wasn't heavily involved in their private affairs. They were off doing other things, making war with the rest of Europe or whatever. But beginning with George III coming to power, the British government says, hey, we've kind of neglected these colonies, but they're ours. We need to start letting them know who's in charge. And so that began a series of what the colonists would regard as transgressions against natural law and against their rights as Englishmen. I'll just run quickly through some. You will remember many of these from your days in college or high school. But you had in 1761, within a year of George III coming to power, the writs of assistance. These were authorized by the Parliament, searches of private property without warrants. They were vociferously opposed in Massachusetts in particular, with James Otis leading the fight against the writs of assistance. And his battle cry will be, you don't do this to Englishmen back home, why are you doing it to us? This is a violation of rights that we have and our ancestors have fought to secure over many, many generations. 1763, we have Parsons' Cause. At that time, the parsons or pastors in the Anglican Church of Virginia were paid by act of the legislature of Virginia. And it was the opinion of the king, 3,000 miles away, that the Virginia legislature hadn't been generous enough to its parsons. And so he ordered that Virginia raise their pay. Now, you might say, well, maybe there was a good case for that. But from the standpoint of Virginians, it was none of his business. He had no business telling us, this is a duty that we've taken on ourselves. It's our legislature that makes these decisions, not the king in London. So this creates some tension. What is known in England as the 7 Years' War, in America, the French and Indian War, comes to an end by 1763. And it left Britain with a dire situation in their national treasury. They wanted to find some way to shore it up, to raise revenues. And of course, they turned to the colonies and figured, hey, we were fighting to defend the colonies, so let's make them pay more. And so Britain began to look for ways to raise taxes directly on the colonists, in part to pay for the stationing of British troops and to pay for the cost of the French and Indian War. In 1764, Parliament passes the Sugar Act with the idea of raising revenue for Britain and also discouraging colonial trade with the Caribbean, which principled colonists will look at as a double whammy. They have no business raising taxes when we're not represented there, and they have no business telling us who we can trade with in our region of the world. The Sugar Act also went a step further. It provided that violators, like smugglers, tax evaders, violators of the Sugar Act would be tried not in the ordinary courts of law, as other Englishmen would normally be, but in admiralty courts, often on ships at sea. This is not what a friendly mother country government does to its subjects. At least that's the way the colonists saw it. And then it was a year later, the Stamp Act. Everybody remembers that one, where Parliament says, okay, on legal documents and books and other things of that nature, you have to have a stamp. You have to pay for a stamp that will be placed there because we need the money. This is the act that will prompt the famous cry, no taxation without representation. And you might think, if you think about that, you might say, well, what were they advocating? Were the colonists saying, we want to elect representatives so that we can send them and represent us in Parliament in London? Well, what would be the purpose of that? I mean, they'd be dramatically outvoted at every turn. No, they didn't mean that. They weren't demanding representation in London. They were saying to London, we have legislatures here. They represent us, and by virtue of that connection, they can legally raise taxes on us if they want, because if we don't like it, we can throw them out. But you have no business taxing us when we have no representatives in your parliamentary body. The colonists organized a tremendously effective boycott of British goods as a result of the Stamp Act. What a daring thing to do. But they did it, and did it so effectively that the Brits within a year backed down and repealed the Stamp Act. But the dummies went one step further, and they passed the Declaratory Act, in which they said, okay, I'm paraphrasing, we will repeal the Stamp Act, but we declare the right of the British Parliament to do anything we want in the colonies because you're ours. That's what the Declaratory Act said. So on the one hand, the colonists could say, well, we won that one, but on the other hand, they could say, but they're going to come back again, and who knows what way come after us. Then you have, of course, in 1770, a rowdy group of colonists begin pelting British soldiers in Boston with snowballs and rocks. And you can argue that they shouldn't have been doing that, but the fact is that the British soldiers fired on them. 5 or 6 were killed, and we had ourselves the so-called Boston Massacre. To a lot of colonists, this was a terrible sign. The mother country is now shooting us in the streets. 1773, the Boston Tea Party. This was such a principled response, by the way, to London. You might say, well, what prompted the colonists to, dressed as Indians, board those ships and throw tea into Boston Harbor? They were objecting to, number one, the tax on tea, which had just been lowered. It wasn't the amount of the tax. They had a much more principled objection. They were objecting to the fact that it was London trying to tax the colonists. And they really shouldn't do that when we have no voice in their parliamentary body. But it was also a principled objection to the monopoly grant of privilege that Parliament gave to the East India Tea Company. Nobody but that company could engage in the tea trade. The colonists were forbidden from it, and this looked like, what? To a typical colonist. They're telling us we can't engage in this particular trade because they want to advantage a particular British company. After the Tea Party, London will close the port of Boston and impose the Intolerable Acts, which included a provision allowing British soldiers to be stationed in British businesses. Now, you might say, oh, I thought it was British homes. It's actually been misinterpreted in history. They never required that you open up your home, or rarely did, to British troops. But they did require that if British troops needed a place and they said to a business owner, we want your warehouse, or we want your place of business, they could do that. So it wasn't quite as invasive, but still, increasingly by this time, the colonists are beginning to think invasions of one a person's liberty is kind of a threat to us all. Then in 1775, things really fall apart fast. In April of that year, the shot heard round the world is fired at Lexington. I don't think we've ever confirmed who did it, who fired that first shot, but it left a number of American patriots dead on the Lexington Green. And a month later, the Second Continental Congress was convened. That's in May of 1775. And a month after that, in June of 75, the Congress names George Washington of Virginia as the commander of a new entity, the Continental Army. George III sees this as the colonies now in open revolt. But we're still a year away from the Declaration of Independence. My book does have chapters on notable heroes of the war years. And so if you are interested particularly in that era or that period, you can read about Native Americans who fought on both sides. Have you ever heard about this Native American from the Oneida tribe, which allied with the American Patriots, I'll tell it to you quickly. There was an Oneida, there were 50 Oneida warriors who were with Washington and his men at Valley Forge in that terrible winter of 77, 78. 50 of them camped with the Continental Army. One of them was especially notable. He had been orphaned as a boy, and Americans of German ancestry took him in, adopted him, not far from an Oneida settlement, and they stayed in touch. They were friendly. And as the boy grew up, he could come and go, and never forgot his Native American roots. But during the time he was taken care of by that German family, they saw to it that he got an exceptional education. He was one of the 50 Oneida warriors at Valley Forge. And from testimony of men who were there, they remarked about how this Indian would, early in the morning, would leave the camp and wander into the woods a little ways, and if you went after and see what he was doing, you would discover he was in the woods singing French opera. Now, talk about the stereotype of Indians, how often does that come up? To see an Indian in the woods singing French opera. One of the amazing stories of this period. I do talk in there about Black Americans, free and slave, who fought the British with words, like Phyllis Wheatley, the first author of a volume of poetry by an American Black author, who also took on the king in her writings. And also, just a word or two in the book about an all-black regiment that trounced 3 fierce assaults by Hessian mercenaries at the Battle of Rhode Island. But I want to zero in the time I have remaining on particular heroes and why they're most interesting. A couple years ago, a friend of mine who was in the Daughters of the American Revolution sent me an email. She said, Larry, you ought to look into this couple from the colonial and revolutionary period. They seem to have been important. Joseph and Esther Reed. And they were from Pennsylvania. She said, maybe you're related to them. So I researched and had the help of an archivist in Washington who directed me to some correspondence between Washington and Mrs. Reed, Esther DeBert Reed. What an amazing couple. Joseph Reed was one of Washington's aide-de-camps. He later, he was elected to the Second Continental Congress. He would become effectively the first governor of Pennsylvania, but they didn't call it back then governor. That position was first known as president. He was president of Pennsylvania back in the 1770s, I guess it was. But I found the story of his wife even more fascinating. Esther decided at one point during the war that she wanted to help out more than she was called upon to do to that point, and she decided, I'll raise money for the American troops. And she wrote a letter to Washington, you can still read it to this day, in which she tells the general, I have a plan, I'll get my lady friends together, we're going to raise money and give it to the troops. And we'd like you to endorse this for us. And we'd like every soldier to get at least $2 of what we raise. Washington writes back and thanks her for her proposed generosity and encourages her, but he says, but I don't think it's a good idea to give the men $2. A lot of them will just use it for drink. So he says, why don't you get your lady friends together, use the money that you raise, and buy the cloth, whatever else you need, and sew clothing, pants and shirts for the men. That's what they really need. So that's what she did. But she wanted the men to remember just who it was who did this for them. And so she had every woman that she had on her team sew their initials and the words from the ladies in the garments that she made. She raised the equivalent today of about $6 million. She was the largest private fundraiser of the American Revolution. Esther Reed. Mercy Otis Warren, often referred to as the conscience of the American Revolution, a woman from Boston who opened her home to the Sons of Liberty at great risk to herself. Their early meetings were often held at Mercy Otis Warren's home. She was a playwright, and she would often write plays. Sometimes she had to do it anonymously to keep herself out of trouble with the Brits. But she would criticize the king, the British governor, Governor Hutchinson, and she was a rabble-rouser and a very effective one. And later, during the period of the writing of the Constitution, she's one of the people urging Madison and those at the Constitutional Convention, make sure you put a Bill of Rights in here. You heard that from the previous speakers. She would have opposed the Constitution without one. And she was also one of the first Americans to write a history of the pre-revolutionary period. When Thomas Jefferson was president and she was still living, he ordered copies for every member of his cabinet and required them to read it, because she very faithfully depicted the colonists and their rising ire against centralization of power and tyranny from London. There were foreigners who helped us, too. We had the Marquis de Lafayette, who at the age of 19, can you imagine? 19, he literally knocks on the door of Independence Hall where the Congress was meeting. And at first, whoever answered the door turned him away. Hey, we got a meeting going on here. And what does this 19-year-old Frenchman want to do disrupting our meeting? Well, he was there to volunteer. And of course, he will later be not only accepted, but endeared by George Washington and others in the Continental Army for his heroic deeds, and remembered by Americans widely to this day. Do you know we just finished the 200th anniversary of his grand tour, where in the 1820s, as an old man, he came back to America, intending to stay for 6 months, just to see what America had become, the country he had given all for its liberty. And Americans greeted him in ways they have not done for any other visitor before or since. He ended up staying 1.5 years, and he visited every single state at that time, the 13 colonies that had become states and the few other ones who had been added. And to this day, you can see places all over the United States named for Lafayette, either before his tour or as a part of his grand tour of America. I should know how to say this because I love Poland, but it's got more consonants in it than I think we even have in the alphabet. Kosciuszko made his name as a Pole who came to America to fight for liberty and became a master engineer of fortifications, earned the rank of brigadier general. Casimir Pulaski, one of only 8 people to this day to ever receive an honorary U.S. citizenship. Only 8 people in all of our history. He's one of them. He wrote to Washington, "I came here where freedom is being defended to serve it and to live or die for it." When the two of them met, each one quickly saw the great merit of the other. Pulaski, in fact, would soon thereafter save Washington's life on the battlefield. Pulaski, that was at Brandywine. Pulaski became, quote, the father of the American cavalry and is buried near Savannah, not far from an 18th century fort that bears his name. He could be a very eloquent guy, too, and I wanted to share with you a few quotes of Casimir Pulaski. He said, "I am ready to die for my country, but I would rather live for it. One man with courage is a majority. Freedom is not given, it is taken." And by that he meant, you can't just sit around and expect somebody to say, "Oh, here, I'll let you have some freedom." You have to grab it and make it yours. He also said, "In the end, it is the person with a burning heart who will make a difference. It is our duty to fight for what is right, even if it means sacrificing everything. I am an officer and a Pole, but above all, I am a soldier of freedom. I have but one sentiment now, and that is to fight for the freedom of my country." Great hero, all the way from Poland. Also, we have, missed my page here. Okay. How many of you have heard of Admiral de Grasse? Okay, he's kind of forgotten. Yeah, he was an admiral in the French fleet, not the top guy. That was Rochambeau, I think, or maybe he was Army. Anyway, Admiral de Grasse did something in 1781 that turned out to be crucial for the war. If you can wind your mental clock back to September of 1781, just before the siege of Yorktown and the fateful Battle of Yorktown. This was a perilous moment. The troops of the Continental Army hadn't been paid for a long time. There were some who were threatening to leave and desert because of that fact. Washington was very concerned about it. He was about to lay siege to Yorktown, and hopefully, if the French fleet showed up at the right time, we might win this whole thing. Well, how do we pay the troops? He felt it was essential that somehow they be paid before any prolonged siege or battle was to be undertaken. And, we had suffered under years of paper hyperinflation at that point. The Second Continental Congress had printed the Continental dollar until it wasn't worth a Continental, if you remember that old phrase. Well, Admiral de Grasse was to take his fleet to Havana, Cuba, expecting that there would be ships ferrying gold and silver from Mexico to Havana. He was going to pick it up and then sail north again to Virginia and get it to Washington so he could pay the troops. De Grasse got to Havana, but the ships from Mexico hadn't arrived yet. So what's he going to do? He doesn't know. Where are they? But time is of the essence. Washington is about to lay siege to Yorktown. He needs the troops to be paid. He takes a solicitation among the residents of Havana. Literally, the British soldiers going door to door saying, "Will you contribute to the American cause?" And you might wonder, why would they do that? Well, first of all, Spain had entered the war. Cuba was a Spanish colony, so they thought they were on our side anyway. But they were also sympathetic to the American message. De Grasse raised, privately through contributions in Havana, large amounts of gold and silver, which he was able to get to Washington in the month of September before the siege began, and to pay those troops. So we were able to fight that battle and win the war, essentially, with the troops having just freshly been paid. Paper money, by the way, this is another chapter in the book, was used by the Brits against America. There was a British vessel, a frigate, a 44-gun, fourth-rate vessel called the Phoenix. It had fired upon Staten Island early in the war and then just anchored off of Staten Island. And then it commenced the real harm that it did. I would argue that it did more harm with what I'm about to tell you than with the guns that it fired. They had somehow managed to get the plates for the American continental currency. They had printing presses on the Phoenix, and they were cranking out paper American continentals and smuggling them onto shore to help the hyperinflation along a little bit. They understood the quantity theory of money that Milton Friedman talked about 200 years later. Haym Salomon, another great, he was Polish also, a financier who arrived in America barely a year before the war broke out. He's a financier, he's a master deal maker. He knows where the money is, and so he's putting together deals, often involving governments and to the French and so forth to help finance the American war. And this guy was so committed to America's freedom, he bankrupted himself in the process. When he died, he was up to his eyeballs in he had given massive amounts of gifts to the Continental Army and other causes relating to the American Revolution. He'd made loans that could never be paid back, but he was that committed to the freedom of this country. Nathan Hale, at 21 years of age, he volunteers to, when Washington says, I need a spy, to go into Manhattan, where the British have occupied, and spy on the Brits. And if you saw the film, I think it's Sons of Liberty is where I saw, or maybe it's, don't quote me, I forget the name of the TV show. But anyway, there's a moment where Hale is amongst a group of others. Washington wants one to step forward to be a spy, a very perilous mission. Nathan Hale steps forward. I'll do it. And of course, his cover is blown in Manhattan, and the British march him off to the gallows. But before he was hung, he said those immortal words, I regret that I have but one life to lose for my country. 21 years of age. Well, how can you talk about heroes without saying a few words about Washington? And I'll do that and then wrap it up. My time goes until when? 5?
5 o'clock.
Oh, 5? Oh, I thought I had an hour. Sorry. Okay. Well, I'll condense this. Let me just tell you this one story about Washington. My contention in the chapter on him in the book is that Washington won the war not because of tremendous military prowess and superiority on the battlefield. He lost twice as many battles as he won, but he knew when to pull back, when to attack, when to harass, and how to exact the greatest toll on the much larger British army. But more than anything else, it was Washington's character that won the war. Why did the men who typically went without pay for months or years, why would those men be so loyal to George Washington? And the more you look into him as a man, the more you realize it was because of his character. The men loved him. He loved them back. They saw him as a pillar of character. He said what he meant what he said. He wouldn't have you do anything he wouldn't do himself. He slept in the same tents with the men that he was commanding. He never took a penny in compensation all during the years that he served as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And one particular incident I'll leave you with especially underscores, in a small way, the character of this remarkable man. It was after the Battle of Germantown, near Philadelphia, which was a British victory. The Americans were trounced, and as the armies separated and went back to their respective camps, and the battlefield sort of cleared, shortly thereafter, a little terrier comes bounding across the field from the British lines into the American camp. And somebody notices that this little dog's got a collar, and the collar has a name on it, the name of the owner. General Howe, the commander of the British forces. And at first, there's a sentiment among the men, according to the accounts of it, they thought, let's keep him. that'll serve that general right. You know, he came over here, so we're just going to keep him. Washington would not hear of it. Gentlemen don't do that to somebody else's dog. So Washington dictated to an aide-de-camp by the name of Alexander Hamilton, lieutenant colonel. He dictated the following letter to be sent with the dog and accompanied by a soldier back to British lines. The note read, and you can still see this, the actual exists in Hamilton's handwriting. General Washington's compliments to General Howe, who does himself the pleasure to return him a dog which accidentally fell into his hands and by the inscription on the collar appears to belong to General Howe. George Washington to General William Howe, October 6, 1777. Now, I am a dog lover, so I was especially touched by that story. And I wish I had more time to tell you more about Washington, but if I told you everything, then you wouldn't buy the book. So thank you for being such a great audience. Appreciate it. Thank you. Questions? Okay. Olivia says I can take 2 quick questions, and I'll be sure my replies are quick. I'm between you and dinner, I understand.
Were you related to the Reeds?
Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention. No, I'm not. That was a big disappointment. I wish I was. I would have been very proud to say so, but couldn't find any familial connection. A fairly common name, I think. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What were 1 or 2 of the stories that inspired General Washington that he often reflected on? Do you remember any of those?
Oh, well, I can tell you something that inspired him was not just a story, it was a document dating back to the 16th century. I point this out in the book. How many have heard of the 110 Rules of Civility? Yeah, it's attributed to Washington, and he may have done some editing of it, but it really originated with Jesuits in the late 16th century. And he carried this list of rules of good behavior with him throughout his life. And I think I do have a reference to, let me share with you, number 100 and, here it is. Number 101 was this. Rinse, that is rinse, R-I-N-S-E, rinse not your mouth in the presence of others. Well, we have no record that Washington ever gargled in front of anybody. So I think he was faithful to that. But the other parts of it were, associate yourself with men of good quality if you esteem your own reputation, for 'tis better to be alone than in bad company. That was number 56. But my personal favorite of all of those rules, because it so neatly encapsulates the character of the adult Washington, it was number 110. Yeah, the earlier one I cited was 101. Number 110, the very last one. Labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. Can't get much better than that. So, thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you.